like Albert said with the song that we sung just before prayers, I was so blessed as we sang that together, 10,000 Reasons. And I remember singing that in the Philippines when I was there in the city of Tacloban. And if you remember from all those years ago when Super Typhoon Yolanda went through the Philippines, and it just wrecked so much of that region, and Tacloban was right in the eye of that. And we toured the beach where the ships had been washed up onto the shore, and there were people living under them because their houses had been washed away. And I sat in a pastor's house which had been underwater only fairly recently. By the time we got there, the waters had all receded and they were in the process of trying to rebuild their lives. And I was on a waterlogged drum kit. Somebody else was playing a guitar that had similarly had waterlogged strings on it. And we played 10,000 Reasons together in a place of utter devastation. But I'd gone there as an ambassador of this church family that had sent around $10,000 that we could provide local communities to rebuild their homes and their churches. And what a blessing to be part of the broader family of God. And as Paul said, to be blessed to be a blessing. That's what we're about. Cross-cultural kind of interactions can sometimes be a little bit challenging though, can't they? We are one family, one global family in Jesus. But sometimes as we navigate the different ways that different parts of that family do life, it's not always simple or predictable as to what's going to happen. Another trip I did overseas was to New Guinea in 2006, and there's us. We're in a motor canoe heading down the Ramu River, and we'd spend 8 to 11 hours a day kind of cramped up in this canoe, going to some communities where around 50 years earlier churches had been established, but then with changes in government policies, all the overseas missionaries had to leave, and so it had been about 30 years since there'd been any significant contact. And we were going as the first group that we knew of to check in on these churches and see how they were going. Well, we arrived at a particular village, and as we disembarked from the canoe and clambered up the muddy bank, we were greeted by screams, war cries actually, coming from the village as a group of warriors charged down towards us, brandishing bows and arrows and spears and looking very, very serious about the fact that we had just landed on their turf. And they kept this up until they were within metres of us. They surrounded us and they're shaking these things in our faces, and I'm just thinking one slip of the fingers and one of us is going to be a bit holier than we were earlier. So it was a really interesting kind of experience. But suddenly the noise stopped and they started milling around us one by one. And then these warriors very, very gently took each of us by the hand and led us into their village to welcome us into their village, where other members of the village were patiently waiting, and they sang beautifully to us and just welcomed us in, and we just had a really lovely time with them. Now, thankfully, a guy who was from this region was with us on the trip, and he had already made contact with the tribal leaders, and they knew we were coming, and they were happy for us to come, and he had told us what to expect when we arrived, because this is a traditional way of greeting. Now, for those who don't share that tradition, that's just weird. That's just not the normal way. If you come to my house, I'm not going to come out armed with something dangerous and say, "Hey, welcome." No, it's just not familiar or comfortable at all, but at least we'd been forewarned so that we would know how we should respond and try not to cause offence in the way that we responded and participated in what was normal in their culture. However, after we'd been in this area, something unfortunate did happen, where a missionary did break one of the cultural rules, and I can understand why it happened. See, the son of a tribal leader had become drunk and violent and was in danger of harming quite a few people around him. So this missionary restrained him and tied him up until he could sober up. And then after that was done, the missionary kind of got out of there because he knew that probably this might not go down terribly well. And sure enough, it didn't. Word was sent by the tribal chief that if this missionary ever came back, that he would be killed on sight. So when the warriors would come streaming down, it wouldn't be part of a greeting, it would be to actually use those weapons and to kill him. And the interesting thing about that is the chief called himself a Christian. So for the next year or so, church leaders in that area are trying to figure out what's the right way to respond to this situation where an offence has occurred, something that shouldn't have happened in that culture the way that it did, and the way that that would normally be dealt with in that culture doesn't really fit with how Christians ought to treat one another. And so the ways of sorting that out culturally which often would escalate into tribal violence, but not always. There were other ways of dealing with it. They were trying to figure out, well, which of those ways are appropriate and which are inappropriate as followers of Jesus. And from an outside point of view, you'd kind of say, well, it's pretty obvious you shouldn't do that. But as people who had grown up in that culture, it wasn't actually as simple as we thought it was to figure out, what does our culture say we should do? What does Jesus say we should do? What does it mean for the church to be about the mission of Jesus, which is to make disciples of all nations? Helping people understand, well, as tribal followers of Jesus in this part of the world, this is how we ought to follow Jesus. As people who live here in Perth, which most of us here in this room do, how are we meant to follow Jesus? It's going to look different. Just like my rendition of 10,000 Reasons looked and sounded different in the Philippines as it did to how it looked and sounded here. Just like when I took communion with some of these believers in Papua New Guinea, we used coconut flesh and coconut milk, not the stuff that we've used this morning, the grape juice and the wafer. Things are going to look and feel and be experienced differently, but what is authentically following Jesus look like in that space and in that culture? And what does it look like in our culture? And what do we do when sometimes we're crossing between cultures and there's sometimes some friction in how that occurs? It's often more of a struggle than we expect it to be. And in fact, just like we had a showdown in that region of Papua New Guinea between people who are operating by different cultural rules, it caused a showdown in the early church as well. And that's what we're going to read about today in Galatians chapter 2. And we're going to spend just a few minutes today getting familiar with the story to understand that these kind of conflicts where followers of Jesus have to figure out, well, how are we going to live in obedience to Christ, given that in our culture we do life like this, those conversations are not always as straightforward as we thought they might be. So Galatians 2, we're going to read through it together. And if you found it in your own Bibles, I always put it up on the screen for you. But it's always nice when you can look at it in your own as well. This is Paul writing, then after 14 years, and if you've been here over recent weeks, you know the backstory. If you haven't been here, I don't have time to tell you today, so just read chapter 1 later and you'll get what's been going on there. After 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. I went up according to a revelation and presented to them the gospel I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to those recognized as leaders. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Greek. This matter arose because some false brothers had infiltrated our ranks to spy on the freedom we have in Christ Jesus, in order to enslave us. But we did not give up and submit to these people for even a moment, so that the truth of the gospel would be preserved for you. Now, from those recognized as important, what they once were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to me. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel for the uncircumcised, just as Peter was for the circumcised. Since the one at work in Peter for an apostleship to the circumcised was also at work in me for the Gentiles. When James, Cephas and John, those recognized as pillars, acknowledged the grace that had been given to me. They gave the right hand of fellowship to me and Barnabas, agreeing that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They asked only that we would remember the poor, which I'd made every effort to do. But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For he regularly ate with the Gentiles before certain men came from James. However, when they came, he withdrew and separated himself because he feared those from the circumcision party. Then the rest of the Jews joined his hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were deviating from the truth of the gospel, I told Cephas in front of everyone, if you, who are a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel Gentiles to live like Jews? We are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. And yet, because we know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ, even we ourselves have believed in Christ Jesus. This was so that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. Because by the works of the law, no human being will be justified. But if we ourselves are found to be sinners while seeking to be justified by Christ, is Christ then a promoter of sin? Absolutely not. If I rebuild those things that I tore down, I show myself to be a lawbreaker. For through the law I died to the law so that I might live for God. I've been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. In the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died for nothing. So what's going on here as you have this crossing of cultures between Jew and Gentile in New Testament times? There's a lot in that chapter, so I want to assure you we're not going to try to understand all of it today. We're going to let Paul explain more of it as we continue to read through the letter after August, which is the month that we're going to spend some time particularly focusing on our mission partnerships around the world. Come September, we're going to come back and dive into those issues in more detail. But the good news about Jesus is for all people in all times and in all places. And it needs to be applied very wisely and courageously to expose and correct the sinfulness of every human culture. See, there's a tendency to be able to spot very easily, like we did with that situation in New Guinea, clearly the way that culture deals with conflict between people is problematic. It doesn't fit with the gospel. They shouldn't do it that way. But how good are we at spotting the ways that the gospel speaks into our own culture? Do we recognise the fact that every culture has elements of beauty and goodness? Just like when we were there, we experienced beautiful hospitality, beautiful communal living and sharing of resources, great humility. There were so many wonderful things, including the gentleness and graciousness of how people treat one another, that were just wonderful to see. But yet embedded in that culture was also some frightening levels of violence. In fact, in this last week, in a region not too far from the one we were travelling in, we've seen intertribal violence break out again and many lives being lost. Every culture, and you need to know this to the core of your being, every culture, including your own culture of origin, has elements of beauty and goodness that God put in people and that have been brought out in the way that people live together. And every culture has elements of sin that also, since Adam's rebellion, have been a part of every human heart and which has grown up to affect the ways that people live together as well. Every culture has both. And as outsiders, sometimes you see the beauty in other cultures and you go, wow, that's amazing. And sometimes you see the sinfulness in cultures and go, wow, that's terrible. And sometimes we aren't as clear in seeing both the good and the bad in our own culture, of being as grateful as we should be for how God's nurtured good things in our culture, and of being as repentant as we should be of the things that sin has caused to grow up in our culture. Jesus calls us to make disciples of all nations. He never calls us to create cultural converts, as though one culture on earth is any way superior to any other culture on earth. He calls us to make disciples of Jesus. And that is exactly the struggle that we read about in Galatians chapter 2. So let me tell you the story of what was going on there. You see, the hostility between Jews and Gentiles was real and it was deep. There'd been 400 years of build-up during Greek and Roman rule. So let me give you a brief history of that part of the world in about 10 seconds. You might be familiar with the Old Testament, how the people of God, when they were disobedient, were disciplined, and at different times, foreign powers came in and overthrew them and exercised rule over them. So you might think of Persia, for example, as one of those empires that came in and controlled. Whether it was the Assyrians or the Persians, what they would generally do in those times was they'd come in, they'd overthrow the local government, they'd put their rulers in place, and then they'd take off. And then what happened after that, they didn't really care about. As long as the tribute was flowing back to the capital city or to the ruling nation, they didn't really care about what they did after that. The Greeks and the Romans were different. When they came in, they asserted their way of living into the local area. So Jews were having not only to see their taxes and their wealth go off to some foreign power, but they also had to put up with people living among them who did not live the same way, who did not have the same values. And we could talk about all the different parts of life where these differences just caused tension. And so even though they were living in their own homeland, foreign people were coming and living in those areas as well, and they were being prevented because of military power from exercising their faith in the ways that they normally would. So they tended to have, in the same region like Galilee, you would have a Gentile town here and a Jewish town there, and those guys just didn't mix at all. They kept as separate as they could. There was resentment about the fact that these others were living in their country, and there was resentment about the fact that they had to tolerate that. They were powerless. And this had built up over 400 years. In fact, it even affected what they did at the temple. Do you remember the story of Jesus rocking up to the temple? And he goes into a place which was known as the court of the Gentiles. This was the place that had been set up so that people could come from around the world, from all kinds of different cultures, and worship the one true God. Do you remember what the Jews had set up there? Marketplace. They weren't all that keen on Gentiles coming and worship. We don't like those people one little bit. In fact, let's just use it for something else. And Jesus came in and he drove the money changers out and said, "How dare you? This is a place of worship for all the nations. This is not just for us." But yet that had been something that had developed in their culture. Do you remember the first time that people tried to kill Jesus? It was in his hometown, Nazareth. And he comes in and he proclaims the year of the Lord's favour, and everyone's like, beautiful, this is excellent. And they're very excited about what Jesus has been teaching and the miracles that he's been doing. But then he tells them that in fact they're going to reject him and not have faith in him, and the Gentiles, in contrast, are going to believe in him, and they are going to receive the blessings that the Jews could have otherwise had. And he says, and this is just like what happened in the days of Elijah and Elisha. Which is true. You can look up those stories in the Old Testament. And the people are furious. How dare he say that God is going to bless Gentiles and that Jews are going to miss out? It was so offensive. They took him to a cliff and tried to throw him off, but Jesus knew his time wasn't come, and he didn't let them do that. So you can see, just from those couple of examples, there's this cultural divide where the Jews feel real enmity with the Gentiles. They consider themselves to be morally superior. We're God's chosen people and nobody else is. And in this context, the early church is growing up and just becoming established. And you know what happens as soon as people start coming to know Jesus? They share that with their family and their friends, and all of their family and friends are Jews. It started among the Jews. Jesus' ministry was primarily among Jews. And so it's a Jewish church. And guess what they inherit? This sense that Gentiles suck. We don't like those people. And in the development of a new culture within the Christian community, God's going to have to deal with this long-held prejudice against a different people group, and a resentment and a hostility and all the stuff that went with that. And how did God do that? Well, it wasn't because the Jewish Christians just by themselves decided, you know what, we need to live differently and we need to have different attitudes toward these people. It actually came about because of persecution. Jews who didn't believe in Jesus were persecuting the Jews who did believe in Jesus. So the Jews who we now call Christians fled. And where did they flee to? Well, where are you going to be safe if you've got Jews trying to get you? Well, go to the Gentiles. They're not going to be there. They don't like those people. So they went to Gentile areas. And as they went, they shared the truth about Jesus, and Gentiles started becoming Christians. And the place that we read about that happening really spectacularly was the city of Antioch. And if you've been here over recent weeks, you've heard a little bit about the story of what was going on in Antioch. And it's a really cool story because in Antioch, you've got the people in the city, and they're used to seeing the Gentile population, which is the bulk of the population, but they're also used to seeing a small Jewish population as well, and they know that those two don't mix. Jews don't like Gentiles, they don't approve of Gentile sexual ethics, they don't approve of Gentile work habits, they don't like the way Gentiles do family life, they don't like the dietary stuff. You know, they just don't like anything really about each other. They don't mix at all. But then you've got this new group, and some of them are Jews, and some of them are Gentiles, and they actually treat each other like family. And the people looking on say, oh, I don't know what to make of this. This is weird. And they have to invent a new name to call this group. You know what they call them? Christians. Why? Because they don't live like Jews, and they don't live like Gentiles. They live like people who are following some guy called Jesus the Christ. I just think that's a beautiful picture of what the church is meant to be. The church is not meant to be this flagship of this is what's good about Western culture. This is what's good about tribal culture. This is what's good about whatever cultural background you might be coming from. The church is meant to be where people say, what's with those people? They don't live like typical Perthites. They don't live like country people or city people or old people or young people or people from an indigenous background or people from a more developed industrial society. There's something else we need to call this. And isn't it great to cause that question into people's minds? Why do these people live like that? Who are they following? Well, it should be clear, we're following Jesus. And that's what was going on in the early church, and that was what was happening in Antioch. And as you hear in Galatians 2, Paul has been a part of this, and he's loving it, but some prophets come from Jerusalem, and remember, Jerusalem is a Jewish stronghold. Not a lot of Gentiles floating around there. The Gentile rulers would come in for certain times of the year, then they get out of there. They didn't like the place. Too many Jews. All right, so this is a Jewish stronghold. And some people come from the church in Jerusalem up to Antioch, and as they're there, they prophesy that there's going to be a famine. And so the Christians at Antioch say, well, we should help our Jewish brothers and sisters out. And they raise some money and they send it down to Jerusalem with Saul, as he was still called at that stage, and Barnabas. And like we just read in Galatians 2, they took another guy, Titus. And what was different about Titus? He's a Gentile. Saul and Barnabas are Jews, Titus is a Gentile. And so as they're travelling down, Paul kind of goes, I wonder how this is going to go. Because he recognises that last time he was there was still this divide. Is it still going to be like that? Or is it going to be like what they've been experiencing up in Antioch? So he gets there and he's worried about it. And so he goes straight to the leaders. He goes to John and to Peter. By the way, Peter's often called Cephas, which is where you saw it in Galatians 2. Just different language, same person. And to James, and he says, well, this is what's happening up there, and this is what I've been teaching about what it means to follow Jesus. And they go, great. We are fully on the same page with you. That's what Jesus commissioned us to do as well. But we're doing it among Jews. You're doing it among Gentiles. Let's both keep it up. We'll keep making disciples of Jesus in our community. You keep going to the people God sent you to. We're a team. We're one church. We're one body. And Paul's like, this is fantastic. They didn't expect Titus to act like a Jew, even though he was in a Jewish city. No, you're a Gentile follower of Jesus. This is fine. But there were some people there that Galatians 2 describes as false brothers. There were some people who were like, yeah, we're following Jesus, but were they really, or were they actually more interested in preserving their Jewish culture? In actual fact, Paul says that's what their real goal was. And they were unsuccessful in getting the leaders to change their mind at that point in time. They didn't give up, though. They're going to stay part of the story, and we're going to read more about those as we continue through the letter of Galatians. But the first half of Galatians chapter 2 is really clear. Hey, when it comes to the development of the church, this intermingling of Jew and Gentile is the natural outworking of what it means to follow Jesus. And all of the Lord's apostles are on the same page. Some might be working more in this area than in that area, but they are one team. They are unified in this until Peter stuffs up. But was it Peter who stuffed up, or was it Paul? That's kind of the awkward situation if you were actually there at the time. Because who's the recognised leader in the church? If you're a Jew, it's Peter. All right? He's been the one based in Jerusalem. He was the one who got the whole thing going on the day of Pentecost. He's the one the other apostles seem to defer to. He's their main spokesman. Peter is the influential guy. If you're a Gentile Christian living in Antioch, who do you consider to be a leader? Paul. He's the guy, he's an expert in the Jewish scriptures, and he's the one who's helped you understand the story of salvation and how it's in this new phase of where it's not your ethnicity, it's not your culture that matters most, it's following Jesus as a Gentile, as a Jew, as somebody from Antioch, as somebody from Rome. Whatever your origin is and whatever your ways of living are, as long as you're following Jesus in that, that's what it's about. And so some are looking to Paul as their example, some are looking to Peter as the natural leader. And as they come together, what we want to see is two guys completely on the same page. And initially they are, but then something changes. So Peter arrives. They're not in Jerusalem anymore. They're not among Jews. So Peter just blends in with the Gentiles. Hey, my culture's not the most important thing about me. Just like when I was in New Guinea, I tried as much as possible to go with the flow of how life happened for those guys. He did that when he went up to Antioch. He's not doing his usual customs, his usual dietary habits, his usual rhythm of life. He's fitting in with the Gentile lifestyle. But then some more Jews arrive from Jerusalem, and what happens? Well, there's more of us now. There were already a bunch of Jews here. Now there's a bunch who have come from Jerusalem, and those guys aren't used to kind of living like the Gentiles do. For them, that still feels really wrong. And so as these guys arrive, Peter starts just fitting in with the guys he knows from back in Jerusalem and doing what they usually do when they're back home in Jerusalem, not even realising, possibly, or maybe realising but choosing not to change and just being a Jew instead of being a Christian in that moment. Living as people who don't quite get on with those people, don't quite invite them to things, don't mingle, we keep ourselves separate. He falls into his old habits because he's around the people who he maintains those habits with. And Paul calls him out on it. He really confronts him because Paul sees the danger of this taking root in Antioch, just the way that had been part of their culture in previous centuries. And he knows it could undermine everything that is unique and beautiful about God's church. What do you pick up in Paul's attitude toward Peter in Galatians 2? I just love, we talked last week about how Paul was a bit of a hothead, shall we say? Like he didn't hold back. And I love the way we see that in Galatians 2, where it's like when Peter came to Antioch, I rebuked him to his face. He was clearly wrong. That sounds like a lot of people I know. And they're not always right either. So what would it have been like, I wonder, for let's just imagine we're that church. And you've got Paul talking like that, and then you've got Peter, who's the established kind of primary leader in the church. For those who were Gentiles, they're probably listening to Paul, confront Peter, and they're going, "Yeah, you tell him that didn't feel good when suddenly, just he's off with his Jewish friends and he's treating us like second-class citizens. You should tell him about that, Paul." And there might have been the Jews from Antioch who, as Galatians 2 told us, when Peter did that, they followed suit, and they're going, "Oh, yeah, I think we have made a bit of a blunder here. I think Paul's right. We've gone back to our old habits before we were followers of Jesus. And whoops, we shouldn't have done that. This is kind of awkward." And then there were the guys who come up from Jerusalem, and they'd be saying, "Who's this punk?" I mean, we're the original church. We're the mother church. It all started with us. We're the ones who have been promoting the gospel. It was Peter and the first apostles who were entrusted with this task. And now you've got some Johnny-come-lately thinking he can lecture the original leading apostle on how he ought to do things. So there's probably a wide range of responses to what Paul's done here. Is Paul in a power struggle? Okay, who are you going to follow, guys? You're going to follow me, like you have been, or are you going to follow Peter? Is that what's going on here? Is this a personality clash? Of Peter's, maybe a bit more easygoing and, let's not get too uptight. These guys are only here for a few weeks. Let's just go with the flow, and then when they've gone, I'll go back to what I was doing before. Is it that Paul's a real stickler and Peter's just more casual about things? Is that the problem? No, actually, this is something that is integral to the gospel, and Paul spots it where Peter missed it. And one of the beautiful things about this story is that it doesn't undermine Peter's leadership in the church one little bit. It doesn't undermine his authority as an apostle. All it does is remind us that the only perfect human being that's ever lived is Jesus. And it doesn't matter who you're looking at. In a local church context, if you're looking at a pastor or elders or people who have been Christians for 50 years or somebody who just came to Christ yesterday, we're all going to mess up sometimes. It doesn't matter what God's called us to do, we are all still human. And we've got to be willing to be gracious to each other and with ourselves about that. We're going to mess up. Now, was Paul being ungracious toward Peter when he told him off to his face? Actually, no. Yes, he did it in his own style, and yes, he was a bit strident as a person, but that's okay. That's how God wired him. Actually, that's what Peter needed in the moment. Do you remember when Jesus had to correct Peter? How did Jesus do it? "Get behind me, Satan." Whoa, that's a bit full on, isn't it? Got Peter's attention though, got through to him, and Peter changed. And that's exactly what happened in this situation as well. Peter needed to hear the truth very, very bluntly. And it just shows you the character of what God had done in his life. He received that truth and he made the change. He saw that he'd actually made a mistake in living by his old habits. When Paul pointed it out, he changed and he continued to live faithfully to the gospel. Peter was actually thankful for Paul on this occasion. Check this out. This is a letter that Peter wrote to the churches toward the end of his life, after the letter to the Galatians had been written and after it had been circulated, and Peter himself knew about it. This is one of Paul's earliest letters. So when Peter, many years later, writes about Paul, is there a power struggle? Is there resentment about how Paul called him out in front of other people and that was embarrassing? Is there hostility? No. He says, also regard the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our dear brother Paul. How do you feel about people who have corrected you in your life? Especially if they've done it publicly. Wouldn't there be a bit of niggle? Who do you think you are? Not with Peter, because he knew that he wasn't perfect, and he's grateful when people help him to become more like Jesus instead of staying as he is. He's a dear brother Paul, and he's written to you according to the wisdom given to him. In other words, including the bit where Paul writes about how Peter messed up, Peter's actually saying, this is wisdom from God. This isn't a difference of opinion. This isn't a different personality style. Paul was hearing from God and he obeyed God in this situation. I was the guy who messed up. What a great leader to be able to speak to people and affirm his own correction in this way. I love the way Peter does that. In his letter to the churches. He was able to handle that correction. See, Paul was actually protecting Peter, because if Peter continued down that track, Peter was not going to have good relationships with Gentiles. His authority, his opportunity to minister would have been completely undermined because he would have fallen back into sinful habits. Paul protected Peter from that as much as he was protecting the Gentiles from being mistreated by Peter. And we need to be willing to do that for one another. We want to be a community that applies the word of God not just to our own personal sins. With personal sins, we tend to hide them away. Have you ever noticed that? If I'm doing something that I know is wrong and you know is wrong, I'll tend to kind of squash that away because I don't want people to see that. But you know what's even, I think, more dangerous than those hidden sins that sometimes are in our lives? It's the public sins. It's the public sins that our culture actually accepts and says, well, this is normal. This is okay. Like Barnabas kind of said, well, this is okay, we'll go along with this. And it was so dangerous. Because why do I need to change that? I'm not feeling convicted by that because my community is saying, no, that's fine. I think we all do that. How dangerous for a Christian is that? And is it possible that just like for the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem and then later on in Antioch, just like for the tribal Christians in Papua New Guinea, is it possible that we might have some of those blind spots where there are certain things that we just say, that's okay, that's normal, we all do that. But maybe they don't fit with following Jesus. And are we willing, like Peter, to hear about that and go, yeah, whoops, my bad. I've fallen into doing stuff again that I already knew up here doesn't fit with Jesus, but somehow my habits just stayed the same. And when I was around that group, I just went back to doing it. And maybe we need some courage to point those things out to one another. And in my experience, it's sometimes when we cross over in cultures, when people come from other cultures into our setting, and when we go from our setting into other people's cultures, sometimes those are the moments where we see things from fresh eyes and go, actually maybe the way that I've been thinking and acting and doing stuff isn't the only way or the only right way or even anywhere near right way. Maybe following Jesus needs to look a bit different than I've been imagining it. What a wonderful and healthy thing for us to be challenged by. Peter obviously felt that it was a good thing to be challenged by. And I wonder if we'll agree with him on that subject. This is what Paul said at the end of chapter 2. And this is the cross-culture that we're interested in. As cultures, as we travel through our time on earth and the places that we go and the people that we meet, and as it brings to light all these assumptions that we have about life, ultimately, as I said earlier, it's not about which culture is getting which things right and wrong. Every culture has beauty, every culture has sin. But this is what counts for a Christian. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I'm living as a middle-class man in Perth. No. Not living as a tribal man in New Guinea. I'm not living as a Jew or a Gentile in the first century. The life I live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. We fix our eyes on Jesus. We welcome anyone who can see Jesus, help us see Jesus more clearly. And anything that does not fit with Jesus, we say, sorry, Lord. Whether I inherited that from my culture as a cultural sin, whether it was one of those hidden personal sins that I allowed to creep in, whichever it was, I'm going to say, sorry, Lord, I'm going to leave that behind so that I can follow you. And that's the journey we're on together. Let's pray.